Steve, did you know that there are only 2 days in the year when we cannot do anything? Yesterday and tomorrow. Today is when we, if we want to change the world, we can. Because our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, but to change ourselves. The future depends on what you do today. Any idea who said those things?
No, but I wanted to be very flippant there, Mark. And I wanted to come in with, and there are 7 days of the week with a Y in it, and that is what I ask every time I step out of bed. However, I do have a canny idea as to who that might have been. Who was it?
Yes. Well, you tell me, because this is your idea.
Well, I think it might have been Mahatma Gandhi, that gentleman that we call Gandhi.
Gandhiji.
Yeah, Mahatma Gandhi.
Why him? Because this is something you came up with.
I was thinking the other week when I was listening to something that there are some real fascinating people that have had an incredible influence on the world. And not everybody knows anything about them. Some people will know a tiny little bit about them, but not everybody will know certain things about them. And so I was thinking to myself, I'd quite like to know a little bit more about some of these people, actually, who are on the sort of periphery of history and the periphery of so many movements here, there and everywhere. And so, obviously, in discussion with you, I came up with the first one that we kick off with, which is Gandhi. And yeah, I'm just interested in, what do we know about him? What do we know about him? Who was he? What was he all about? And I think that this that he came to mind because I recently finished reading that that book of Churchill. Winston Churchill's Blood, Toil, Tears and Sweat, the Great Speeches. And in chapter 9 of that book, he talks about Gandhi, and he refers to him as a seditious Middle Temple lawyer. And, and I thought to myself, interesting. Was he just a seditious Middle Temple lawyer? Or was he something a bit more than that?
Well, according to Churchill, he was the half-naked fakir, wasn't it?
He was indeed. Churchill didn't have a great many things good to say about him, to be honest, but I'm sure we might touch into that as we chat through a little bit about this man's life and just some of the things that he stood for.
Yeah, and I think that's crucial because you say Churchill, who himself was a great man, didn't care for
outstanding.
him. And really, is it Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi?
Yep.
Have I got that right?
Yep.
He's at that nexus point in history where really it's fading away now. Because I was thinking, what kind of a legacy did he leave? And he left a huge legacy for people of India from 1948 onwards when they gained independence after a long struggle, which he was part of. And, I watched a video about him recently. He's still considered the father of India by many. But the new generation of India who are making their money through wealth, the middle class, they're not listening anymore to the likes of Gandhi, who talks about renouncing everything and living a simplistic life. Yeah. So he's quickly, in our time, is being almost looked at differently than when we were young and when we got to know Gandhi. So that would be an interesting thing to talk about.
And the big question is, does he look like Ben Kingsley?
Actually, that's an interesting point. I was thinking about that movie.
Yep.
Massive amount of extras. It's sprawling, but it required a very clipped Englishman to do it, not an Indian. So does that tell you a lot?
Well, it tells you lots about all sorts of things, I'm sure. So, but yeah, so I guess sort of kicking off with some of the sort of things that were interesting to me was and I don't want to talk about sort of where he was born and all the rest of it unless you decide to bring that in and want to discuss it. But one of the sort of number one things about this gentleman is that he was a leader of non-violent resistance.
Yes.
So he had this philosophy, Gandhi's satyagraha, which is made up of two Hindu or actually Sanskrit words, satya meaning truth and agraha meaning insistence or holding firmly. And so satyagraha translates to holding firmly to the truth or the truth force. And so this approach to truth force or even soul force became this method of nonviolent resistance against oppression. And that philosophy really sort of has influenced civil rights and freedom movements across the globe, isn't it? We see what that has done. I mean, if you were to take the sort of legacy beyond Gandhi, you're looking at Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement. You're looking at Nelson Mandela in South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, and other advocates of sort of social justice worldwide. So this sort of non-violent resistance that he kicked off, and the sort of principles around that, I think are quite interesting in today's world. So I'd be quite interested in sort of picking out. I've identified like 6 key principles of satyagraha, which I would like to just sort of touch on, chuck out there, and we'll see where we go with it.
Cool. Just before you do then, because you talked about satya, but sat is another word in its own. It means eternal spirit. So
nice.
we've got to remember that he had a very Hindu, godly look on the world. Yet it wasn't Hindu at the same time, because he worked tirelessly to get rid of this idea of the Dalit, the untouchables, the caste system. And again, that's going to be part of his ethos, because I think he looked very much at human dignity. And that's a key thing that I know you're going to possibly talk about, and we could learn from outside of him. Because I think, yes, we can talk about him, we can talk about his personality, what he stood for, but what's the relevance beyond India and to people today?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, if you were to just look at some of those central principles of this nonviolent resistance that he has, you've got a principle of something called ahimsa, which is non-violence, and so Gandhi,
Buddhism and Hinduism.
and so Gandhi saw that as a real sort of, he had that as a real personal ethic, but he also saw this personal ethic which he wove into a political strategy. And that was really smart. I think that was really smart. You've got a personal ethic that motivates you, that drives you, that you live your life by, and that you can then weave into a purpose that you're looking to pursue, which then brings the whole of you into that purpose. So I think that was quite a smart move.
Very smart move, but we must also recognise, although it's non-violent, that doesn't mean it's not provocative, because he did the dhoti movement, which is wearing the clothes of the poor, which in other words, he was putting a finger up against westernized clothes. He talked about the spinning movement, which we can talk about later, to sidestep British imports, and therefore that was very provocative to the British. He ended up put in jail for it. And the Salt March to Dandi, and a protest against. So although it's non-violent, that doesn't mean he sat on back and just prayed for change. He was prepared to go out and do it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the very fact that with that Salt March, I mean, that was like a 240-mile walk to the Arabian Sea to protest against the British salt taxes, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And, that was I think the Salt March, and I'm sure somebody will correct me, became like the symbol for against colonial rule. It became such a powerful symbol against colonial rule, and as you say, he was a huge advocate for this simplicity and self-reliance. So promoting that simple living, that self-reliance, that self-sufficiency. Famously, wearing his homespun kadir to protest against these British industrial goods, and encouraging Indians to actually revive their traditional crafts. I mean, there is so much when I look around the world today with the globalization of the world. And there's a term which I used to use in my old world, which was this term of subsidiarity, which is getting local decisions to be made as close to the actual thing rather than being centralized and moved out of the way. And so you see this sort of advocacy for simplicity, for self-reliance, for a real strong regional footprint. which I think would stand completely opposed to the globalization that we're seeing today.
Yeah.
And so some of the ethics and principles that he lived in his life, you could drag across and apply that same tactic, that same principle to, to protesting about things that are going on today.
I think you talked about the NVDA, the Nonviolent Direct Action. Now, this is as applicable now as it has ever been. And and not just his time, way before his time in different cultures. The fact that he was prepared to be mocked, vilified, classed as a criminal, possibly physically beaten. I mean, he was thrown off a train in South Africa. And this is the other thing as well. He renounced a lot of wealth. He deliberately gave up his own wealth. He was well-to-do. And that is something that we find in other cultures, in other places, don't we? Somebody you follow has something very similar, that you've got this. The great strength in people is that it's not the toxic masculinity. It's not the person who could shout the loudest or could be the most strongest. He epitomizes the kind of person that will be renowned for being almost exactly opposite the culture around him. And boy, did he stand out like a sore thumb. To be non-violent is as applicable now as it has ever been, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And to implement a different way of living is always something which is going to go against the status quo, right? So even when you take a concept, and I'll just briefly touch into it, the concept of the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. So the kingdom of heaven, Malakut Shamayin, kingdom of God, Malakut Shaddai in the Hebrew, is all about the rule, the reign, the sovereignty of God here on earth, in contrast to the worldly powers, in order to present an alternative social reality. So the rolling out of this philosophy of his, this non-violence, this also promoting, looking to promote religious harmony, because he's a big advocate of religious harmony. He wanted all religions to work together. He tried to foster peace between Hindus and Muslims. He, particularly during times when there was communal violence going on and sort of community violence going on, and that interfaith, I guess, harmony that he sought to do is quite a significant part of his legacy. The irony is he was assassinated by a Hindu, and the other double irony of looking at that, from what I can see, is that he was assassinated by a Hindu, which is a polytheistic belief system, many gods, who didn't like the fact that he was engaging with other gods, other faiths, outside the sort of Hindu boundaries, even though Hinduism is a polytheistic belief. And he was calling for religious tolerance, which is the same thing and the very issue on which he and Winston Churchill completely agreed. They both agreed on religious tolerance, and both he and Churchill both thought that there could be a potential problem in that area.
You're always going to get fanatics in all religions, in all faiths and non-faiths, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, I said this before, reading about Nazi Germany, and there was a report I read about families in Hamburg, and there were like 15% of the population, even the Nazis didn't know what to do with. They couldn't control them. So think about that. Gandhi, he's a thorn in the side of many who pitch themselves as violence and want to hurt. And a fascinating person that just comes to mind, and it's slightly off track here, is Viktor Frankl.
Oh, yeah, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, and that was the greatest book written in 1946. So when he was released from his concentration camp, and he's a psychologist, psychiatrist, was he Austrian? I think he was Austrian, but he was Germanic. He said he was interviewed in the 50s, and he looked so good, real presence about him. And someone said, how did you manage to survive? And he said, the people who didn't survive were the ones who were big, brawny, and thought they could fight back. The people who survived who had clear thought and they could see a better tomorrow. That's something to look forward to. That's Gandhi to a T. He was like puny. He basically put up with Well, the fact that he was wearing clothes, it can get cold in India at times. He didn't worry about that. And yet he had this clear vision that is something we should all study because he did it for the right reasons.
That's right. It's having that very clear purpose in life, that you strive towards. If you have a purpose in life, you can go through hell and back, providing that you have a very clear understanding of your purpose. It's people that don't know where they're going or why they're going that really struggle with this. And it's like one of the other principles, isn't it, of this Satyagraha, which is that Satya, it's the truth. Gandhi really believed that the ultimate reality and all of the actions that he carried out should align with both moral and ethical truths.
Yeah.
He really believed that. So things like honesty, courage to uphold what was right, absolutely regardless of personal cost, and that makes him a very interesting individual, particularly in an era where I would say that truth had perhaps lost its toehold in some of the way things were being done, and so he stood in stark contrast to some of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, interesting little man. Really interesting little man.
He still stands in stark contrast, unfortunately. He was anti-capitalist to an extent. He believed that nobody should have any possessions. Who's going to do that nowadays in today's society? Really, very few. He believed in a life of simplicity, godliness, but although he had a very strong moral and spiritual self, he, by renouncing any sexual relationships with his wife to become celibate, instantly outside of a tradition, especially in the West, would have come across as being something slightly fanatical. And I think that's the slight issue here, that a lot of what he did makes sense in India, but not necessarily outside of India. And although he's become a fascinating person for a lot of people, I don't think it's necessarily appreciated how far he went to renounce the things around him in the cause of trying to get India liberated. He went to an extreme end that I don't think people today fully grasp or could do. Very few.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that there are times in history where, when you look back throughout history, there are certain individuals who come to the forefront of that historical timeline. And they are exceptional individuals who stand in contrast to the backdrop behind them. And he's one of these guys in the 20th century who stood in contrast to what was going on behind him. For those reasons, he renounced certain things. By making that sort of very clear and outward demonstration of, this is who I stand with and this is what I'm now going to pursue. As I say, he becomes an individual of, probably I said he stands in contrast. He almost becomes an individual of colour against a very black and white world. And he stands out as something really interesting. One of the other principles of being a Satyagahi, an adherent to Satyagraha, is self-sacrifice. Being expected to suffer without retaliating. So that type of ethic in his thinking, which obviously becoming celibate and stopping certain pleasures of the flesh, would also include things like fasting. So he would fast, he'd be willing to accept imprisonment, he would be willing to endure violence in order to demonstrate the inner moral conviction that he had. And in doing that, he sort of, his appeal is not being made to the outward display of power of the empire at the time. His appeal is being made to the conscience of the empire, if you like, the conscience of the people that are leading the empire. And when you start to appeal to somebody's conscience, that makes them feel very uncomfortable. And it's a great tactic, but it's a long game.
It is a very long game, and some would argue has it yet been won. The interesting thing about him is that I made a note here, something you just said, and I can't find where I wrote it down now, about his eccentricity. Yeah, he was considered fanatical and eccentric, wasn't he, by some? But that fascinates me, because to say someone is eccentric means you're outside of the norm of what we consider Where if we look back now to the 1920s, or certainly the 1910s, we would consider the British then to be slightly eccentric.
Oh, totally.
But the thing is, he pared back everything to the way people were living for thousands of years. And, okay, if he came along today and he did exactly what he did, one, would it make the news? And two, would it be as effective?
Come the moment, come the man, right? So he came within his right time. And I think he came at the time that he was needed, in exactly the same way as people like Churchill came at exactly the time they're needed. Alexander the Great at exactly the time that he was needed. Ataturk at exactly the time that he was needed. Genghis Khan at exactly the time that he was needed. All of these people have had a significant part to play at the time that they were needed. Now, whether that need turns out to be a good thing or a bad thing doesn't matter. They came to play a part, and it was a significant part. And I think that whether or not Gandhi would have had the same influence today, I would hate to suggest how he would be labelled today, but I suspect it wouldn't be favourably in many quarters, and I think he'd be dismissed as a whack job in many others.
I could see him being in prison today.
Yeah. But I mean, again, one of those other principles of Satyagraha is being fearless, right? Being fearless, and he emphasised that courage and inner strength. So that courage, that inner strength, fueled by his very clear understanding of purpose, is something that he could draw on and show in order to resist oppression. That is something that is timeless. That is timeless. We just talked about Viktor Frankl with Man's Search for Meaning, and the fact that he could see beyond, that he could draw on something. He may not have been the most physically impressive man or the biggest man or the fittest man, but the fact that in his mind he could project. I think all the time that you have the functionality and the capability of your mind to project a better future, you have a hope. And all the time you have a hope, you have something to live for and something to strive for. And this little man, he seemed to be able to draw on that. He was very fearless. And what's also quite interesting, I think, is that he remained having a very strong faith in the people he was standing up against. So he believed, as part of his ethic of beliefs, Satyagraha, that everybody has got the capacity for good in them, and that they can be persuaded through love and through truth. And even if they are not converted to your cause, they don't need to be coerced, because by appealing to them with love and truth, it will appeal to this moral sense, this moral compass that they have, which I think also is quite fascinating, because I'm an ex-detective, and sometimes there are some people that I have looked at and I've gone, mate, you are rotten to the core. There is nothing that I can appeal to you, to your humanity, that is ever going to change anything. What you are is what you have chosen to become, to allow yourself to become, and that's it. And any spark of any goodness is not there. Well, Gandhi fundamentally believed that everybody has got that capacity for good in them and can be persuaded through love and truth. He was a better man than me. I'm not so sure.
And therein lies a problem, because when you say me, it could be we. Because I'm struck by the fact that Gandhi is typical of one of the greats that you study, and he's a bit like others of his type, although not necessarily giving up everything, clothes and land. I can think of, you already mentioned Martin Luther King. And there are others who, through non-violence, but plain talking, we now hold up and in reverence of what they were and what they stood for. The amount of political change he brought about is immense, especially for India. When you consider the Indian subcontinent in terms of the population, there were problems with the partition. No one's saying anything else. But the fact that he achieved something that politicians couldn't.
Yeah.
So why do we keep putting in power politicians who are everything opposite to what this guy was? And we don't try and find, and perhaps there aren't any more, perhaps we will never find another Gandhi or people like him in our times. But there must be out there, but they're overlooked, they're ignored. But we never get them on the stage of politics in charge, do we?
No, we don't. And I think that this has come out of what's happened over the last 150 years with the sort of rationalistic movement and the death of God, and there is no metaphysical. When you look at all of the principles that are drawn from his ethic, they're drawn from a higher power. Now, whatever you believe that to be, that's a topic for another conversation. But he recognises that there is something far bigger than himself. So his belief in the metaphysical, his belief in the non-material, his belief in the spiritual is something that infuses and drives his actions. Not just so that you can sit there chanting, singing hymns, but that also so you could produce some sort of constructive program out of all of those great ethics and principles. So it wasn't just about opposing injustice. It was about opposing injustice and building the alternative. This is what we can do instead. So the creation of self-reliant communities through, as you say, the activities that we talked about, through spinning stuff, through promoting education, through looking at addressing social inequalities. I mean, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I think that's why he was in South Africa, wasn't it? To look out for the Indians and the discriminatory laws that were being pushed out in that country. I didn't realise that he was actually there for so long. He was there for a very long time, about 21 years. So yeah, so it's a very strong spiritual ethic, which is then infuses actual material action. So a non-material ethic and ethos which infuses a material action. And today, God is dead, and so politicians are driven by what? What are they driven by? To serve the greater good of who? Well, to serve themselves. My greater good, exactly, themselves. And I think that's what we've lost. We've lost servant leadership. And we've talked about this on previous episodes with what being a leader is. We've lost servant leadership. We've lost leadership at the highest level of those who would look to do good for others, i.e. their nation, their country, their people. They're interested in self-serving.
The other thing as well, lest we big up Gandhi too far, there are aspects of his character that some find a bit disturbing, if not, let's not malign somebody who's no longer with us, but for context and balance. And again, take this with a pinch of salt. We don't know if he's being maligned here deliberately. Some accused him of not being a good father. He was supposedly bullied his eldest son. But also, I believe, and this may have been often put to one side, especially in India, at one point he converted to Islam, supposedly. But great pressure was brought back into Hinduism. So, if that is correct, and also he was said to really fall for flattery. If you wanted to get on his good side, flatter him. And, okay, no one's perfect in the earthly realm that we know of. I mean, you'd say that somebody was perfect, but that's a slightly different point. And actually, that's another thing about Gandhi. You like to say, don't you, about his relationship with Christ and Christians. What is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it was in South Africa that he ended up rejecting Christianity because of Christians. And one of his sayings post that period was, when he was asked about why, you're so, your attitude and the way that you are is so like Christ. Why not a Christian? And he said, I love your Christ. It's your Christians I don't like. They're so unlike your Christ. And I think to myself, yeah, that hasn't changed much. That really hasn't changed much.
No.
I love your Christ, but it's your Christians I don't like. They're so unlike your Christ. And that's absolutely right. And we still see that played out today. I think one of the things is, Mark, and it's an absolutely valid point to raise, what tends to happen in society today is we elevate people onto a pedestal, and then once they're as high up as they're going to get, we take great delight in trying to shoot them off it and to cancel them, rather than actually going, this person is an individual who's not worth putting on a pedestal and worshipping, but who is worth understanding, who is worth listening to in certain areas, but they're not the highest power. And so because we have jettisoned the highest power, we will fill that with figures, human figures, who are fallible. And everybody is fallible. Everybody will let you down. Every human being will let you down. And even the best intentioned ones will let you down at some point, for some reason. And if your world then collapses because, oh no, they're not perfect, well, they're human. What do you expect? So yeah, Gandhi was not a perfect man, and he would have had many flaws. But I guess I would look at that as part of the rich tapestry of his character. And I think that to make a beautiful tapestry, you need some black threads in it. You need some dark, you know.
You can drop a stitch now and then.
That's it, you know. Leave a little gap, make that a bit more quirky. I've got lots of stitches dropped, and I've got lots of dark in my tapestry, mate.
Yeah, you're like a Swiss cheese, mate.
Oh, I tell you. Goodness me.
So with Gandhi then, obviously one of the greatest men or personages in history. Superb what he achieved, and the fact that our generation especially knows a lot about him. But do you know, I did a straw poll, not admittedly very big, asked a couple of kids, one's 15, one's about 19, 20. Never heard of him.
I know. And this is why these people are worth talking about.
Yeah.
Because they've got a lot to offer. I mean, his global influence reaches on beyond the grave. His teachings on peace, on justice, equality. He's an enduring figure in global history, and he's somebody we should know about. We have merely skimmed the surface. We have skipped that stone across the top of the surface of the lake. And if this gets even one person to go to a library or to go to a bookshop or to go to a second-hand bookshop and find a book on Gandhi, take it home and read it. I mean, it'd be worth doing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is as well, is when you study someone like Gandhi, and not just the events, but the stuff behind it, because he effectively wanted to achieve moksha, liberation of the spirit. He wanted to make it so that, you know, the spirit got away from all the stuff that keeps everyone tied. The thing is, that's almost impossible for people now, to renounce something that we all now thrive on. It's almost got to the point where that potentially is almost, in the West, impossible to do. His standard is so great. It's great to study, but it's almost impossible in this modern era, in this modern world, especially in India, to do. But then again, does that mean we should never study him? No, I think he should be. He's an elite, but he's not elitist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that he's worth studying, like all of these people from the past. Firstly, they're worth studying to understand what made them the men, and it was predominantly men that have been captured in history. And that's not to say that there weren't great women around, but I'm particularly focusing on this particular man. What made him? How did he get there? What shaped him to be the type of individual that he was? And what can we learn from him today? So it's all about, and as I try to do when I unpack the Bible, it's understand what was going on in the culture, in the context at that time, and what are the truth principles that we can then bridge forward to the 21st century and build into our lives to make the way that we conduct ourselves slightly different and give an alternative to what we see going on around us to benefit those around us. Yeah.
So there you go, Gandhi.
A little bit on Gandhi.
just a little bit in Gandhi. And it'll be probably the first of quite a few we'd like to cover. There's a lot of people in history that's really should be brought back and remembered for various reasons.
Remember, people die twice. Once when they die physically, and once when you stop speaking their names. So let's speak a few names and resurrect some of these voices from the past.
Okay, so
Very good.
ta-ta for now.
TTFN.